Hi everyone, I'm Yuriy Hrytsyna, and today I'll be hosting this session, this last Tête-à-tête for Docudays Festival. Our guest today is Ukrainian-Canadian filmmaker Oksana Karpovych, and this is her debut film. Don't worry, the doors will open. It premiered in Montreal Documentary Festival, and today this is the online Ukrainian premiere of this film. You have a chance to watch it until tomorrow, 6 p.m. So I'm going to greet Oksana first. Oksana, how are you doing? Hi, Yuri, I'm fine. Oksana is in Montreal right now, and a few technical announcements before we start, so that the audience who perhaps first joined Docudays online. So the film is available online. After you watch it, you can vote for it there by using the right number of stars that you sing. The award ceremony is tomorrow, including the audience prize that is based on the result of that vote. Tomorrow, 9 p.m. on Docudays website. This stream is on docudays.ua website, and it will be later available on YouTube and on Facebook. On Facebook, it will be in original language, that is Ukrainian. On YouTube, English interpreting will be available. Feel free to ask your questions via Facebook and YouTube streams. And generally, Docudays Festival or the national competition will end tomorrow with the award ceremony. So the film is available for only one day, but all other films apart from the national competition will be available until the 10th of May. So there is a host of interesting films there. Additionally, Docudays managed to do the impossible thing, basically by translating all program in online. I know the effort it takes. Therefore, I suppose the Docudays team should be supported by donation. There's this capability on the website, and you'll get a lot of fun rewards for donating. Okay, so much for the announcements, and we get started. And as we kick off, I have this comment. I watched all films in the national competition. I mean, all films can be recommended for watching. And there is a peculiar thing but for every film. But I basically fell in love with your film, Oksana. And when you are in love, Oksana, it's difficult to reason and to speak logically, but I'll have to make the case for this talk after all. And also, since this is the last screening within the national competition, I want to draw some parallels with other films in the competition and maybe look for similarities or differences between the films that were available for watching. Right, so this was my foreword, just to set the stage. But I'll start with a very classic question that usually opens up all talks like that. Could you introduce yourself to the audience, please? What did you do before you ended up in Canada? How did you end up in Canada? Why did you choose filmmaking? And generally, where this idea of suburban train films came up. So I'm opening it up to you. Okay, Yuriy, where do I start then? Before I moved to Canada, which happened in 2013, so it's been 7 years. I was a student of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. I listened to cultural studies. So I swapped master's program in order to go and live in Canada. It's quite a personal story how I ended up in Canada. But I was looking for ways. It was kind of planned. And then the circumstances were in favor of my being here. But before I moved to Canada, I had this idea that I want to do cinema. In 2011, I was a volunteer at Docudays festival, and it transformed my life in a way because it opened up an entire world of documentaries for me. I was enchanted. I was so excited and enthralled. I realized this is what I want to do, and this is what I should be good at. So when I moved to Canada, I got into a film school. We have quite a famous school that is based in Montreal. And I was a student there for 4 years, and I graduated 2 years ago. So the idea of suburban trains, well, it's linked to the fact that I moved as well. It's actually a very trite story, a platitude. Upon coming to Montreal, I thought a lot about my childhood, about the past, and these suburban train were my memory. And I thought they were incredibly important. And I wanted to film them, to shoot them, to come back to Ukraine, to see them again, and to realize why they're so significant for me. Why, as a child, I was so triggered by them. I don't know. This is how it started. It's actually a platitude, nothing dramatic. Right. Oksana. So it all started with a photography project, right? So you took pictures because you're a photographer as well. You take a lot of pictures, and then it sort of expanded. Is that right? Yuri, yes, I started taking pictures, and I think it was a way for me to research things. I don't have a video camera, by the way. I only have a photo camera. And apparently, it was the best way to manifest myself in this suburban train and to see how people take it. It was very peculiar experience. Initially, I was nervous and anxious. I wasn't sure how exactly I should how to come up to people, because anyone who was on a suburban train knows it's an open space. Whatever you do, wherever you stand, everybody will see you, and you will see everybody. There's nowhere to hide there. And this is therefore quite awkward, not only to observe everyone else, but you have to get over certain things. And it was the summer, and this is when I met Alexander Tikmenyov, and I'm happy that there was this meeting because he he kicked up my ass, sort of. He just said I shouldn't be afraid, I should get down and do it, and just do it at full speed, that people will feel that, and people won't have this perception like you're doing something wrong or misbehaving or concealing things. That was the beginning. So he had a point. And then the project evolved and became something else. And it was a really interesting experience. Oksana, I envy people who can film other people. It's type of street photography or do documentary. Last year, Roman Bohun's film, this was like cosmic shooting. It's mind-boggling. How did he deal with those situations? Because he could have provoked people into aggressive behavior easily. But it's great that he managed it to be open, not to hide. This is a documentary method as a fly on the wall. But you're not a fly on the wall. You're Oksana with a camera. Yuri, in our case, it was simply virtually impossible. I realized it at the very beginning, so I had to come to terms with this. And closer to the end, I also learned how to do it to our benefit and try to be less conspicuous, because the camera always attracts certain people who would be willing to speak. Therefore, the less we concealed it, the more helpful people we were, because people would approach us with their stories, which is a great experience, in fact. Oksana, you are a woman. Did it help? Was it a help or a hindrance as you shoot the film? Yuri, I believe it was more a hindrance, because people often don't think a woman is in charge. So I had to prove that out of 4 team members, there was a DOP, the sound engineer, and an assistant. So if people had questions, they addressed the DOP or the audio engineer, because apparently they didn't feel I was in charge. So I had to explain it to them that I'm actually the boss. And it sapped my energy, drained my resources. That was not a nice thing. On the flip side, though, if the fact that I was woman helped to clear the air sometime and make the vibes more mellow, maybe because because of my appearance, they thought I was a student, a school pupil, so people were more relaxed and were not afraid of me, or not too serious. It's quite an interesting story with the DOP, because you had a British photographer, Christopher Nunn, who worked in Ukraine a lot. And in a way, he's famous for shooting the anti-terrorist operation there in Ukraine. And he was wounded in 2015. He almost lost eyesight on one eye. And he still works in Ukraine. He does his photography projects. But on your Facebook page, I read this interesting story. The story of how his trauma changed the optics of a person, because he doesn't speak Russian or Ukrainian, but he kept filming people who were constantly talking. Maybe you have a comment about it, Oksana. Well, Yura, I'll actually clarify things. Chris didn't film that much of the war. He was in Ukraine. He just happened to be in Ukraine way before the war started. And I think Ukraine has been the subject of his photo shoot for like 7 years or maybe more. Therefore, where in January 2017, he was in Avdiivka, that was heavily shelled at the time. And he had to do a photo in the evening for some project. And a shell hit the house where Chris was. And unfortunately, a woman he knew was dead. And Chris had multiple injuries. One of those was in the face, and he endured several surgeries in the hospital. And basically, they saved his eye, and they didn't say the eyesight though on one of the eyes. So currently, the situation is not very stable. He can't see with one eye, and that was a very tragic story. We don't know actually how to talk about, and we looked at this shooting because we didn't want to put this in the spotlight, really. This is Chris's take on things. He's reluctant to talk about it for a long time. He doesn't want it to happen because he thinks he's no more special than thousands of people on Donbass. That's why he tries to navigate those dangerous waters. But obviously it affected our filming a lot. And I marvel at him because he did such a brilliant job with using only one eye, because it didn't affect the quality of the image or the composition at all. Everything was great. I mean, it was physically difficult because he often gets headaches and it's just using too much energy for looking with only one eye. So physically, it was a trial for him, but nevertheless, the quality of his artwork was stable. Nothing changed. And therefore, I respect him very much. And I appreciate very much for agreeing to this endeavor regardless.
And really, in the context of his photography, it would be interesting to talk about the topic of the post-Soviet reality. This is something that's becoming ever more popular in the West, and we're seeing more and more photo projects by people who travel, let's say, from Europe or the US, and we see that the architecture of brutalism and Soviet modernism, and we see them becoming subject of coffee table books, and we see that there's a growing interest to that in Ukraine as well. And on Facebook, we have all of these communities praising or exploring the aesthetics of post-Soviet urbanism. There's there's also a community by Danilo Rafkovsky and Andrei Rachinsky. I don't know if we can call that nostalgia, because I think it wouldn't be proper to call this nostalgia. This is a longing for an aesthetic which was possible in the past, but now it's only possible in some degraded and shifted form. But nevertheless, it's very interesting to the generations who never got to live through the 90s. And that is used as an argument against this aesthetic, because the people who lived through that are saying that you're only marveling at it superficially because you never got to live through the real thing. And now we have this renaissance of this interest towards the small man. And an unofficial manifesto to that would be the text of Artem Chapai, who published a book called The Ukraine. So that's an incorrect name, because normally in English you would not use the definite article with Ukraine. So there's official Ukraine, which you need to love patriotically, and which is very easily categorizable and definable. And then there's the unofficial Ukraine, which we encounter in everyday life, which is incorrect and non-specific and improper, which we love and hate at the same time. And I think Artem Chapai has been able to grasp that, not through aesthetics as much as through a practical approach. So it looks like your film is about the practice of the 90s, not about the aesthetics of the 90s, because we see that the 90s never actually finished, because they start as you leave the city of Kyiv in a suburban train, and you don't really get to enjoy this aesthetic like those people who spread this idea, like a new est. So there's a very controversial term which is used in the West. You just show the practice and the mechanics of this life. So where do you see in this system of coordinates Is this, are you in the aesthetics of the 90s or in the modernity and practice, etc.? What would you say to that? I think this was one of the reasons to make this film, is this feeling of this incredible contrast between Kiev and the suburbs. And I got to live for a while in the downtown Kiev, in Zoloty Vorota and other central districts, which is very beautiful, and it's a very different reality. Because, and then from that from that reality you step into a suburban train or go um, into the rural areas, you see that these worlds actually exist in parallel. And for many times it felt that the 90s never actually ended in the suburbs. People still use the same Soviet-style suburban rails. They're still looking for those jobs, and they're selling those vegetables in open markets just to make ends meet. So when when you talk to them, you realize that they're very much present in this life, and they're also, sorry about that. They're they're also present in the life of my family, because it was always seemed to me that some people have never actually left the 90s. So it was quite obvious for me to pick this topic, and it was very interesting to film too. I don't know what constitutes this nostalgia for the generation that never lived through the 90s, but my generation are the people who actually lived in the independent Ukraine, and we have this point of reevaluation and maybe acceptance of our experience and the experience of our families. So I believe that this is a generational thing, but at the same time, we see a growing interest in the West towards Eastern Europe, and we know that there's this term called the New World, which is a very Western concept, which which the West, for some reason, believes that it's it's an emerging thing, but it's not emerging. It has been existing for a while, and now it's just that they have just noticed it and started to commoditize and try to sell it. So I don't know if that answers your question. Well, actually, you did bring up this topic, which you can feel in your narrative, because when you look at the national program, among all of the films on the national program, yours is arguably the most personal. It seems like it is your dialogue with this reality from which you're trying to grasp something about yourself. And you can you tell us a little bit more about how this film relates to your story, or how much is this film about you and your feelings of Ukraine and Canada now in 2020? This is definitely a film about the life of my family, and it reflects the reality of my family, who work at a plant and use a suburban train to commute. That's first. And secondly, could you ask the question again? How much is this a film about you, or is this a film about your feeling of Ukraine in this distance from Ukraine in space and time, you being in Canada right now? Actually, both. So this is a film about the reality of my family, and this is about the reality of when I visit my family in Ukraine. Then there's also this concept of distance, that I look on Ukraine from a very privileged viewpoint because I get to see it from the side, from a distance, and that gives me a certain advantage. So the film has both. Okay. I also, when I was thinking about your film, I was thinking about what kind of description I could make up about it, but actually found it somewhere else, in the Happy Events book by Belarusis, which is about interviews with internally displaced women from the zone of the anti-terrorist operation. These interviews are fictionalized and depersonalized, so you can't really understand which is real and which is fiction, but there's this unreliable effect. So I would like to read a passage from the introduction of Miss Belarusis. Insignificant and unexpressed has become a focus of my interest because it never turns into trophies, which are written about by Walter Benjamin about the trophies of history, the trophies that are taken from the past to the future, which, like bricks, constitute the narrative of history. So that's the first introduction, and then in the description to about her book, which she gives in her text, she is more poetic. And there's this short passage about those who I met, and in the middle of a small space which encompassed my view in a fog drenched street, there was a man dozing under a blanket, and the pose of this man constitutes the annotation towards this book. So this kind of grasps what you can really see in your film. This is a film about the situations, and not really situations, but rather states. This is a film about history and about the bodies in space which are telling their stories. I um, I just keep on talking for a while, so maybe I should rather ask you, what would be your brief description of your film to convince a person who has never watched documentary films, who's just going on the next seat on the suburban train, why they should watch your film? I actually like this text by Miss Belarusis, and in my film, I attempted to catch and grasp something that can't really be grasped, to grasp those states and moments which it's impossible to explain otherwise. And it's great that the cinema actually allows you to grasp these states which you fail to describe otherwise. But I think that on the one hand, this is a film about my identity, because this is a meta narrative of the film, which I don't really articulate, but I keep them with me. They all come from my personal experience. On the other hand, this is my film about the human condition and the condition of people in the modern Ukraine, about this position that they're in this posture in society, about how they feel themselves in this posture.
It's quite interesting. If you look at the film that were part of competition this year, you can see that they are mostly about groups of people and made by groups of people. So this is where directors collaborate. Tatiana Kononenko plus Matilda Mester. Then there was Roman Khmer and Irina Moleshchuk, and Roman Bublik shot a film that was basically shot for him by many cinematographers. The military who provided their footage. Having said that, I think the similar topic for all those films are groups of people or teams, starting with a small group, the family from Irina Tsilik's films, and coming all the way to the big group of people, such as the military, them finding a form of expressing their experiences. Your film. Also, how people tell about themselves. The language they choose to convey that story is also a way for us to observe people finding words to describe their biographies, to describe where they are in the world, how they ended up there, and what's coming in the future. I was very much impressed. I don't know if it was planned to program films like that, but you can easily capture their ideas. So we have the question from the audience. We actually have two questions. The first question. The person who grew up in a railway hub says, "Thank you so much for the film. Teen spirit is the key idea for this festival. You also have teenagers in your film. What was the special about filming young adults?" Yuri, I believe actually they weren't our target audience. We were mostly interested. I mean, we are interested in the use, but there are not that many young people in suburban trains. I mean, the population of those trains is markedly different from the Frankfurt population. You are most likely to encounter elderly people there, but the young people tend to use suburban trains especially when they have to travel to universities or educational institutions. Well, I can't say that there was any peculiar or particular experience. Our approach was the same for them. Oksana, but you choose children and teenagers as a point, and this angst, it makes this angst more even more significant. I think in the end of the film there are children. It looks like the children were always important for you. You had this photo project where you chose siblings, you had this series of photos, and I believe it's a very interesting statement. Yuri, I love shooting children, actually. I did 3 short films about children. This is my interest still. I think children are very honest about perceiving the reality. They might not speak, but their pose is something I'm very interested in, always. They had their idiosyncrasies in perceiving the reality, and they're being incredibly sincere and authentic. When we were shooting the film, we had a very interesting story with the girl that we see at the end. It's bizarre, but we actually spent loads of time with her. Out of 30 days, we spent 6 days with her. But there's only basically one scene where she appears in the film. I wanted to have a character in this film who would demonstrate a different perspective on the suburban train. Maybe for her, suburban train was something that it was for me at the time of my childhood. You know, it's like the sense of adventure. something optimistic, in fact, something positive, something that gives hope. It might take you to places you don't expect, but it's something that's exciting. So, children in my film are those characters precisely. They have a different perception. Obviously, they have a more positive outlook on the suburban train because they don't have horrible or unpleasant life experiences as opposed to the elderly. We have 2 more questions from the same audience member. So, as you worked on the film, did your characters happen to obsess you? Did you have dreams about them? And if so, how did you manage that? And question 2, what do you think? How did the life of the suburban train passenger changed when now in these conditions any travel is impossible? Well, because suburban train rides have been cancelled for 1.5 months in Ukraine. Yuri, I pondered a lot about it. I gave it a lot of thought, and I'm actually nervous for suburban trains passengers when all trains have been cancelled, because this is hope for many, especially for peddlers. This is basically how they make their living. This is their workplace. And for elderly people from the villages, this is also work, because this is how they get to Kyiv to sell their vegetables that they grow. For the homeless or for those who don't have a job, this is a place to stay. This is where they look for things because they have nowhere else to go. Actually, I'm very anxious for how the passengers feel right now. I think they're having a hard time. Just to underscore the importance of suburban trains in provincial places for certain characters, I think, especially now, you can sense it very strongly. What was the first question? Oksana, did any of the characters possess you and haunt you, and did you have dreams about any of them? Yuri, generally, no, I don't think there were people like that. I mean, I cherished them in my own way, all of them, depending on how much time I spent with each of them. In the end of the film, there are these 2 grandmothers. One of them is crying and says that she was robbed of her money. And I had special feelings for this granny because I met her 1 year before I actually shot her in the film, just on Kyiv train station, and I gave her a dog. It's a very long story, actually. But I remember this granny. A year ago, she looked much better as opposed to when I showed her in my film. She definitely looked much better. So I wouldn't say this is her problem at all. And just by coincidence, we bump into her again. We actually filmed a different grandma. But then we meet this old woman who's called Nina, and I thought that she declined so much because she looks much worse. She has fewer teeth. She definitely has a problem with her psyche and some social problem too. I think it's abuse and impunity because what happened at home, it's been lasting a while and nobody can do anything about it. So I had a lot of compassion for her, and I think of her often. And how is she doing today? Is she alive still? Well, generally, there were so many people that we filmed, So it's difficult to think of everyone. But I have anxious, especially for the seller of newspapers. He's very dear to me. He's like a friend. So I call him and I dial him from Canada asking how he's doing. Oh, I think this man will be all audiences' favorite after this film. Well, actually, what I'm hinting at, and there's the suburban trains have disappeared, and Paul Cézanne had this quote saying, "Everything disappears. Make haste if you want to see something." I suppose this is a definition for documentary. Do you think documentaries must mobilize, or rather it must archive reality? Does documentary have to impart energy, or rather conserve and save this energy for the future? I believe that documentaries, as any art, can perform a number of functions, and maybe a couple of functions at the same time. I think both qualities are significant and needed. And in my case, I think first and foremost, I document time and space. I'm hopeful that in 10 years' time, this film will be of interest still. On the other hand, I think you have a point there about energy. Maybe it doesn't mobilize anyone because this was not the goal today. But maybe I believe in more subtle and slower processes. So maybe people keep thinking about it. So maybe some people reach certain conclusions thanks to that film. Oksana, I think we can think about this film that occurred to me first thing after I watched your film. This is film Chantal Lackerman, 1993. In French, the title is The Est, from the East or Eastwards or about the East. There are multiple ways to translate that title. I think this is one of the key films for entire history of the cinema, not only the documentary. Chantal Ackerman did this film after the dissolution of the USSR, where she took her small crew and went eastwards in the former Soviet republics. So she traveled the East Germany, Poland, Ukraine, for example. She filmed the city of Lviv, and she filmed a lot in Russia too. This is a seemingly static film, and there are so many moments where just this camera is located in the car window, and there are like miles and miles of queues that is in winter in Moscow are waiting for the bus that is not coming. There are also sequences in the waiting rooms on train stations. And this is a film about expecting something you're not sure about, waiting for transport that will never come. And there is a wealth of interesting moment there. Because this was a film, they also turned it into an installation. I know you wanted to turn your film in an installation as well. I think you had that idea. But again, I saw that Godard commented on that film that this is not the way to film poverty. I only heard this phrase once. I never saw it in print. I never saw his explanation why. But I'd like to ask you, how can you shoot poverty? Because this is one of the topics of your film. I think poverty needs to be shot as any other topic. And it's important too. I think people ask if you need to love your characters, those that you film. I think you don't have to love them, but it's important that you respect them. And to observe them attentively. I think it's an important prerequisite that you are filming this without certain hierarchy. There was an interesting notion with the editor of Chantal Lecaman, this woman who was the editor, and she shared the experience of working with her, and for a long time that they collaborated. She said that Ackermann's take was the following: you should neither love nor judge your characters, so you should look for the middle ground. And this middle ground is something that I look for in all projects with photography or with film. So I want to take a step back where I can peruse and look at these people with attentively and listen to them very well, and not to be excited and not to be over emotional or over reactional as to what they say. So
Yeah, that's very well said about distance, about the close distance, because the DOP who made this film, he didn't speak Ukrainian or Russian. Neither did the editors, and they have never visited Ukraine before either. And did you need this distance as a part of this project? Did that contribute, or was that just a coincidence? Now, looking back at the process, I don't know if that was beneficial or not, or whether it was exhausting, because it was. Because working with people who have never been to Ukraine, I had to keep explaining what this or that was, or why this or that moment was more or less important. So there were both advantages and disadvantages. And regarding Chris, for example, who doesn't speak, he doesn't speak Ukrainian or Russian. He understands something, but he doesn't speak. For us, what really mattered most was a shared vision and knowing that we can both communicate in English, and that was sufficient for me. What mattered for me is that throughout these several years that he shot in Ukraine, he developed a certain method which I thought was very proven that it works. For me, that was very much sufficient, and there were some things that I noticed where, for example, Chris was shooting not something that I was expecting him to be shooting. So someone was saying something very important, and he was shooting the other way. But then these errors, seemingly which were errors, they ended up contributing to the film overall. And of course, we had to look for alternative ways to edit the film. We had to look for a non-traditional narrative device, because we had a recording. For example, we would have a recording of the voice but not of the image, or an image but not the voice. So that was a mosaic of content which was very varied, but it all had doubtlessly had texture, but it was nevertheless very hard to manipulate into a cohesive picture. But I think it was all for the better, though. I think everything has its own explanation, and everything ended up playing in our favor. I would like to add something too. Working with editors who never worked in Ukraine, who don't speak Ukrainian, I had this thing about having to explain everything to them, and the editor, without being outside of the Ukrainian cultural context, he enabled me to reevaluate some things by having to explain some things that I thought were obvious. That it did create another layer of understanding, which we also tried to narrate in the film. So that's concerning the process. I'd like to make another compliment to you, saying that your camera goes where cameras don't really go that often. It's not a very dangerous place. It's a very everyday place, very common place, and a place that we fail to look attentively at. We even from the anti-terrorist operation, we see a lot of footage, but people don't really film suburban trains because they seem to be uninteresting. And Robert Frank, an American photographer, once mentioned that it is important to see what is unseen. And I think this is something that you do with great skill. And in fact, these people appear to be invisible to the majority of society. Do they know about that? They doubtlessly do. I think they understand this very well and they actually discuss that very often. They know that they appear to be invisible because their life is not valued from the very beginning. They appear to be unimportant and unneeded to the society at large and the government in specific. So this invisibility manifests itself in the conditions in which they live and they commute. They it's like they don't exist at all, so it doesn't matter how they commute or live in the first place. And once I heard a scary thing from a female passenger in the train. She looked at the people in the car and she said, "Look, this is this is just a freight train or a prison train of people going to work into Kiev." So the comparison of these cargo freight trains were used to transport either animals or military personnel or prisoners into concentration camps. So this comparison of our people going to work to Kiev to this freight train was eerie. And I had this impression of people going on this train. It wasn't, I didn't have a feeling that they were willingly commuting, but as if they were moved as a mass or as a goods. That is very powerful and scary at the same time. Well, I think we still have time to answer one more question from the audience. Uh, do you know whether there has been any prior work and documentaries about suburban trains? Well, doing my research, I found at least three films about commuter trains. One about Alexei Rudinsky, about Kiev from the viewpoint of a train. There was another Georgian film, The Tunnel. It's about suburban trains also. And even in the Ukrainian program, there's some work about trains. Before, I don't think there were films specifically dedicated to suburban trains, but there is also a very interesting film, I think, from the late 80s. I don't recall its exact name, but it's a short film about the in difference in the and the width of the railway tracks in Ukraine and Europe. It's called That Many Millimeters, something like 24 millimeters. It's an observation of how they have to widen the wheelbase when the train crosses the border from Poland into the Soviet Union. And that is also a film that describes the railway life in Europe and the Soviet Union. in 2018, we had a book by Pavlo Stech called The Catcher in the Rye. And it's also a book of reportage of his interviews in suburban trains. And it was awarded and nominated and awarded in an essay contest called "Why I Will Never Leave This Place." So this is something that unites us. We're both directors. We both emigrated, and we both made our first films outside of Ukraine. And how this could be reformulated for us, I think this is something we could rephrase this something like why we will always come back. So why? I know a lot of people who don't want to hear anything about Ukraine anymore. But for me, it's quite a different story. I have a very different attitude towards my country. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like I never left. I have very tight knit connections to my family, a lot of my friends, and I have a very close connection to the culture and the language and the culture. And I here, I don't feel different because when I feel very comfortable back in Ukraine. I don't feel different from other Ukrainians. So definitely I plan to keep returning. I see. Well, we are coming towards the end of this tête-à-tête meeting. So we have 5 minutes remaining. So do you have anything else you'd like to communicate to your viewers or the people who are endeavoring to make a documentary film? Maybe about the fact that it's not that difficult after all. Making a film, that depends on your process and your gaze. My process was very long and protected. This actually started with poetry and went into photography, and then finally it transitioned into this humongous project, and it's still ongoing in a way. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences in my life. I started it. I was a different person when I started it. So it was a certain learning for experience for me. So I definitely advise for it for to anyone who wants to do it. And the most important thing is understanding that it's a process, that the finalization of the film happens at the very end, and that it has to be fun. I see. I think I was wondering whether I should do it or not, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to end this in a poem, and it's about the memory of the 90s and about my reflection of the topic. And I'm going to read it. It's superficially very depressive, especially if you know about about the story of Boris Ryzhy, the Russian poet who wrote this in the year 2000 when he was age 25. I will not recite his biography, but I will just read this. It's better to go by tram into the past. Being a schoolboy, in 5 or 6 stops, we go into the 80s. To the left are factories, to the right are plants. Light up a cigarette. Don't mumble skeptically. This all comes from the book of We Are Old Trash. Smiles with tears on your face. It's our stop. Here are banners. Here are Red Sky and Dante. Just play along with the musicians and leave to the sounds of it. with a leather jacket and hands in your pants along a street of eternal sorrow into the sundown, come back as a killed soldier. I believe that this somehow relates to documentary films as well, because documentaries are about coming to a place that might never exist anymore, and maybe to visit a time that has never existed in the first place. Thank you very much. Boris Ruzhy is it's a great poet of the 90s. Yeah, he's very cool. There was even a film about him. So this is where we draw our discussion to a close. We'd like to thank Docudays. We'd like to thank them for the opportunity. This is a new format, but I believe that this format will allow more people to access cinema. Docudays are doing a great job. The traveling Docudays. The traveling Docudays enabled so many people to see documentaries like never before. It built communities around it, and I think it's it's about it's now a lot of discussion about whether films are even viewable on smaller screens. But with traveling Docudays, they would use some very broken projectors in smaller libraries, and that's probably more important than the red carpet and the big premieres. So our hearts stay with Docudays. I agree. That's it. Have a beautiful day. Have a great future, and let your film have a great future. Okay.